term memory war captures the political struggles that occur between states to assign meaning and exercise control over historical narratives. With the nation building that took place after the collapse of the Soviet Union, memory wars have become recurrent in the post-Soviet space. The newly independent states have tended to portray the USSR as a repressive, occupying force in their national histories, whereas the Kremlin, as the legal successor to the Soviet Union, has made defending its version of historical memory a matter of national security.
The process of securitizing history began in earnest in 2009 with a declaration in the National Security Strategy of the need to protect the dignity of Russia's historical narratives. A presidential commission was created to counter attempts to falsify history to the detriment of Russia's interests. The process intensified in 2012 when Vladimir Putin returned to office for a third term and refounded the Russian Historical Society and the Russian Military Historical Society. The goal was to consolidate the resources of the state for the study of Russia's military historical past and to counter attempts to distort it. Soon after, the foundational documents of Russian security policy, the foreign policy concept, military doctrine, and national security strategy would each include the need to defend Russia's history. By 2021, the national security strategy alone would mention history and memory nearly 30 times. Russia's politicization of memory emerged in a specific geopolitical context and responded in large measure to wider regional trends. For example, after their countries were admitted to the European Union in May 2004, certain nationally minded politicians in former Warsaw Pact states such as Poland and the Czech Republic, aided by their counterparts in the Baltics, began to agitate to have the EU recognize the crimes of Stalinism as commensurate with those of Nazism. It is therefore no coincidence that the Russian state created an increasingly mythologized narrative of World War II, beginning in the mid-2000s, intended to uphold the probity of the state. As a result, the past has more and more become instrumentalized as a weapon in what the Kremlin today depicts as a civilizational competition between a traditionally minded Eastern Slavic bloc and a hedonistic and enervated West. The evolution of the Kremlin's historical narrative has been vividly displayed in the official May 9th Victory Day parades on Red Square. Held for the first time in post-Soviet Russia in 1995, the 50th anniversary parade was a rather somber affair. By the next decade, however, it had emerged as an annual showcase for Russia's military might. While fewer Western heads of state attended the 2010 event than did in 2005, in 2010 the Kremlin was still willing to discuss World War II in terms of a common victory shared between the Allied powers. Yet by the 70th anniversary of the Second World War's end in 2015, this rhetoric had been abandoned. Instead, Indian and Chinese troops were invited to march on Red Square for the first time, while Putin declared in a press conference with Xi Jinping the day before that the heroic past Russia and China share provides a good basis for developing their relations in the 21st century. Vladimir Putin's obsession with history is not an esoteric indulgence to be mocked, but a central component of the worldview that led him to order the invasion of Ukraine.
Мною принято решение о проведении специальной военной операции. Ее цель – защита людей, которые на протяжении 8 лет подвергаются издевательствам, геноциду со стороны киевского режима. И для этого мы будем стремиться к демилитаризации и денацификации Украины.
The creation of this worldview has been effective because it has been so consistent. In 2014, Russian state media and politicians began to invest heavily in the argument that a gang of Nazis and their collaborators seized control of Ukraine during the 2014 Revolution of Dignity. Over the last 8 years of conflict in the Donbass, the Kremlin and its media have been able to use tropes and symbols as a reference to this larger narrative. In this way, references to denazification in 2022 can almost be understood as metonymy of the original historical framing narrative. This narrative is not simply about demonizing Ukrainians, but also aims to mobilize Russians and to legitimize the Kremlin's policies. In its efforts to find a unifying national idea to cohere an ethnically, religiously, and ideologically diverse country, the Kremlin has mythologized the cultural memory of the Great Patriotic War and attempted to make it a mainstay of everyday life through everything from after-school clubs to murals on apartment buildings. This banalization of the Great Patriotic War, combined with the prehistory of historically framing Ukraine as a Nazi state, may ultimately be the most effective parts of the Russian government's long-term propaganda plan in relation to Ukraine. But even if post-Soviet states have invested significant resources into crafting historical narratives, it remains unclear to what extent these have worked their way into the minds of people. Looking at the situation in Russia, it is obvious that the regime has been extremely successful at limiting the available frames of remembering through memory laws, the constitutional amendments of 2020, or changes introduced to the penal code. An authoritarian state is very effective at restricting public frames of remembering. But looking at the social level, we realize that it is much more difficult for the state to influence other frames of remembering. Young people in particular have been at the center of the state's attention to craft historical narratives, be this via reforms of the history curriculum, patriotic youth education, or through youth movements such as Yunarmia, the Young Army. Regular focus group discussions among young people illustrate some of the results of these political developments and demonstrate the extent to which memories of the Great Patriotic War dominate the historical reference of young Russians. War narratives have turned into an ideational foundation for many of the young generation. It is moreover remarkable that even those participants in focus groups who indicated that they went to protests against the government or that they are critical of President Putin, defended the country's historical narratives. Some argued, for instance, that Russia would not have won the Great Patriotic War without a strong and dictatorial head, and claimed that a weak leader like Nicholas II would have caused soldiers to desert en masse. Other focus group participants underline the positive economic benefits that Stalin allegedly brought. On the other hand, the violence of the time is devoid of perpetrators. There is no agency ascribed to anything that can potentially damage the unproblematic historical picture that we have seen emerge in Russia over time.
The language of denazification that dominates Russia's rhetoric in the war against Ukraine builds on a long-term process of crafting the Russian historical consciousness. At the same time, the saturation of the public sphere with historical narratives concerning an event that happened roughly 80 years ago has contributed to a certain degree of mnemonic fatigue among Russians. To frame the so-called special military operation in the language of World War II could thus backfire, given that the Russian population also shows an awareness of the double standards inherent in this argumentation. Even though the population embraces the importance of commemorating Victory Day, it largely disapproves of the ways in which the regime abuses the Great Patriotic War for its own purposes.